scarred duke can only be healed by a woman who sees his heart, not his title. The rain that fell on Blackwood Manor was a permanent fixture, a weeping gray shroud that clung to the granite battlements and slicked the ancient stones with a perpetual sheen of misery. Inside, Duke Alastair Beaumont felt the dampness in his very bones. It was a reflection of the chill that had settled in his soul since the war, since the fire that had carved a map of ruin across the left side of his face. He was a ghost in his own home, a creature of shadows and silence, banished not by the king's decree but by his own reflection in the merciless silver of a looking-glass. His world was the oppressive gloom of the library, the scent of decaying paper and dust a more constant companion than any living soul. Miles away, in a village nestled in the valley below, Alara tended a different kind of fire. The warmth of her father's bakery was a constant, comforting embrace, the air thick with the honest scent of baking bread. Flour dusted her capable hands, a soft white powder that clung to her worn dress and settled in the auburn strands of her hair. Hers was a world of simple dignity and quiet struggle, a life measured in rising dough and dwindling coin. That life shattered the day the Duke's steward arrived, his face a mask of grim duty. Her father's debts, long ignored, had been called in by the estate. There was no money. There was only one currency left to offer, her service. Alara was to be sent to the dreaded, lightless manor on the cliffs, to serve the monstrous duke that children whispered of in frightened tones. The carriage ride to Blackwood was a journey into twilight. The moment Alara stepped inside the great hall, the warmth of the world seemed to vanish, swallowed by cold stone and echoing silence. The housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, was a woman carved from the same granite as the manor, her instructions delivered in a clipped, dispassionate tone that offered no comfort. Alara was assigned the humblest of tasks, relegated to the kitchens and laundry, a ghost of a different sort in this house of shadows. For a week, she saw nothing of its master. He was a rumor, a heavy footstep in the corridor above, a plate of untouched food returned to the kitchens. Her first summons came without warning. "The Duke requires you." "In the library," Mrs. Gable stated, her expression unreadable. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs as she entered the cavernous room. It was a tomb of books, suffocating under a blanket of dust. A lone figure stood silhouetted against a tall, rain-streaked window, a study in black and gray. "You are the baker's daughter," he said. The voice was a low rumble, rough with disuse, yet possessed a timbre of command that sent a shiver down her spine. "I am, Your Grace." He turned slowly, deliberately letting the weak light catch the ruined side of his face. The scar tissue was a violent, puckered landscape, pulling one eye slightly wider than the other, twisting his lip into a permanent sneer. It was a fearsome sight, calculated to make her flinch, to make her look away in horror as all the others had. Alara met his gaze. She saw the pain etched there, the profound loneliness in his one good eye, and held her ground. She dipped into a simple curtsy, her eyes never leaving his. "Alara, at your service." Alastair felt a jolt, a flicker of something unfamiliar. Disappointment? No, it was surprise. There was no gasp, no revulsion, only a steady, unnerving calm in her hazel eyes. He was the monster of Blackwood, a title he had cultivated to ensure his solitude. This quiet, flower-dusted girl refused to play her part. "This library has been neglected," he said, his voice harsher than intended. "You will restore it. I want every book cleaned, every shelf polished. It is an impossible task. You will likely fail." "I will do my best, Your Grace," she replied, her voice soft but firm. It was a challenge and a dismissal. He retreated into the shadows, leaving her in the silent, dusty crypt, but a sliver of her unexpected composure followed him. Days bled into weeks. Alara worked with a methodical patience that bordered on reverence, treating each leather-bound volume as a treasure. The silence of the library became her sanctuary. She learned the geography of the room, the scent of old paper, the way the light shifted as the perpetual rain strengthened or waned. Alastair would watch her sometimes from the darkened upper gallery, a silent observer of her tireless industry. He had expected her to complain, to weep, to beg for a different assignment. She did none of those things. She simply worked, her presence a small, steady flame in the cold heart of his home. One afternoon, the heavens broke open. A ferocious storm raged against the manor, the wind howling like a banshee. With a splintering crack, a latch on one of the high-arched windows gave way. The window flew open, and a torrent of wind and rain blasted into the room, directly onto a fragile collection of illuminated manuscripts. Alara cried out, not in fear, but in distress for the books. She scrambled onto a chair, fighting to reach the window, her small frame no match for the gale. Suddenly, he was there. Alistair moved with a startling speed, his large body shielding her as he battled the window, his muscles straining as he finally forced it shut and slammed the bolt home. For a breathless moment, they stood frozen, inches apart. Rainwater dripped from his hair and soaked the shoulder of his coat. Their hands, which had both been on the window frame, were now braced against the wall, his covering hers. He looked down at her, at the genuine panic in her eyes, panic for the welfare of his property. She was drenched and shivering, a smudge of dust on her cheek. "The manuscripts," she whispered, her voice trembling. He followed her gaze to the sodden pages. Instead of the fury she expected, a strange expression crossed his face. He had spent years cultivating a fortress of solitude, and this woman was more concerned with his forgotten relics than her own comfort. "They can be dried," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. He slowly withdrew his hand from hers, the brief warmth of his touch leaving her skin tingling. "Thank you, Alara." It was the first time he had used her name. The storm raged on outside, but within the walls of the library, something had irrevocably shifted. The first crack had appeared in the Duke's armor. A fragile truce settled between them. Alistair began to spend his days in the library, reading in a distant armchair while Alara worked. The silence was no longer heavy and oppressive, but companionable. He found himself breaking it, first with a question about a passage in a book, then with a story of its acquisition by his grandfather. He spoke of history, of philosophy, of worlds far beyond the stone walls of Blackwood. In return, she told him of village life, of the rhythm of the seasons, of the simple art of coaxing life from flower and water. Her voice was a balm to his frayed nerves. Through the library window, a small, forgotten rose garden lay choked with weeds. One morning, Alistair saw her out there during her brief respite, her capable hands gently clearing the thorns from a single, resilient bush that still clung to life. She was nurturing it, coaxing it back from the brink. He watched her, a painful ache blooming in his chest. She was bringing life not only to his books and his garden, but to the very air in his desolate home. He began to leave the fire lit for her before she arrived in the mornings, a silent acknowledgement, a small offering of warmth. The scent of wood smoke and old roses began to replace the smell of dust and decay. He was drawn to her light, even as every instinct screamed at him to retreat back into the darkness that had been his only shield. He was a duke. She was a servant. To bridge that chasm was to invite ruin for them both. Their fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of a polished black carriage. Lord Valerius, Alistair's cousin, strode into Blackwood Manor with the entitled air of a man surveying his future property. He was handsome, charming, and possessed eyes as cold and calculating as a winter sea. He had come, he claimed, to inquire after his dear cousin's health. Alistair knew he had come to measure the master for his coffin. Valerius found them in the library. He swept his gaze over the room, his lip curling in a faint sneer at the signs of restoration. His eyes landed on Alara, who was carefully repairing the spine of a book. "Well, cousin?" Valerius drawled, his voice slick with insinuation. "I see you've acquired some new decor. Does it speak?" Alistair went rigid. A cold, dangerous fury, an emotion he had not felt since the war, surged through him. He moved to stand between Valerius and Alara, a silent, imposing shield. "Her name is Alara," he said, his voice lethally quiet. "And she is under my protection." The words hung in the air, a clear and unambiguous declaration. It was a line drawn in the stone floor of the castle. Alara's breath caught in her throat. He had never been so direct, so possessive. Valerius merely chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Protective of the staff, are we? How noble. One must be careful such attachments aren't misconstrued as instability." The threat was veiled but unmistakable. Valerius was not just an unwelcome guest. He was a predator, circling, and he had just identified Alistair's weakness. When he finally departed, the chill he left behind was far worse than any storm. Alistair had acted to protect her, and in doing so, he had placed her directly in his enemy's path. The stakes of their impossible connection had just become dangerously real. The confrontation with Valerius left a palpable tension in its wake. Alistair became more withdrawn, the shadows claiming him once more. Yet, the memory of his protective stance, the raw possessiveness in his voice, resonated between them. He had defended her. He had claimed her. One evening, as the fire crackled in the great hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls, Alara sat mending a frayed tapestry, her fingers moving with quiet grace. Alistair watched her from his chair, the conflict warring within him. He was tired of hiding. He rose and walked to the fireplace, standing beside her. The firelight illuminated the harsh lines of his scars, painting them in hues of orange and red. He raised a hand and lightly touched the jagged line that bisected his eyebrow and trailed down his cheek. "It was a fire," he said, his voice a raw whisper that was nearly lost to the crackle of the flames. "During the war, a munitions tent exploded. I pulled a man from the blaze before it consumed him." He paused, his gaze distant, lost in the hell of that memory. He lived. This was the price. It was the most profound confession he had ever offered, a piece of his broken past laid bare. Alara looked up at him, her heart aching with a sudden, fierce compassion. She saw not the monster but the hero. Slowly, she lifted her hand, her fingers hesitating in the air just before they reached his face, not daring to touch but wanting to soothe. "It is a mark of honor, your grace," she breathed, her voice thick with emotion. Not of shame. The space between them crackled with an intensity that stole the air from her lungs. The chasm of their stations, the danger from Valerius, the impossibility of it all. It melted away in the heat of the firelight. He looked down at her, his tortured gaze searching hers, and he saw not pity, but an unwavering acceptance. It was more than he could bear. He leaned down, closing the small distance between them, and his lips met hers. The kiss was hesitant at first, a question asked in the dark. Then, as she responded with a soft sigh, it deepened, pouring all his unspoken loneliness, all his desperate yearning, into that single, shattering moment of connection. The kiss was a cataclysm. It broke through the last of Alistair's defenses, flooding him with a terrifying, exhilarating hope. But as the warmth spread through his veins, so too did the ice of reality. He was a duke. She was a servant. A life with her was a fantasy that would see her ruined, ostracized, and used as a weapon against him by men like Valerius. The very thought was a knife in his gut. He had to protect her, and he knew with a sickening certainty that the only way to protect her from his world was to expel her from it. His resolve was tested only days later. Valerius returned, and he did not come alone. Flanked by a stern-faced physician and a bewigged magistrate, he entered the great hall with an air of triumphant gravity. He had filed a formal petition to have Alistair's fitness to manage his own affairs, and the dukedom legally reviewed. The grounds were his reclusiveness, his violent tempers, and, as Valerius announced with theatrical sorrow, his unhealthy and obsessive fixation on a common serving girl. Alara, who had been summoned to the hall, stood frozen in horror. Valerius's gaze slid to her, dripping with contemptuous pity. Alistair saw it all in a flash. The public inquiry, Alara being forced to testify, her name and reputation dragged through the mud, forever branded as the Mad Duke's whore. He could not allow it. He had to save her, even if it meant destroying himself and her heart in the process. He drew himself up to his full height, his face becoming a mask of cold, aristocratic disdain. He looked past Alara as if she were a piece of furniture. A fixation? He scoffed, his voice ringing with cruel amusement. He turned his gaze on Valerius. My dear cousin, you mistake boredom for obsession. The girl was a momentary diversion, a pleasant enough distraction from the tedium of this place. He finally looked at Alara, his eyes flat and merciless, devoid of any of the warmth she had come to know. She is of no consequence. Her work here is done. Send her away. Each word was a physical blow. Alara stared at him, her mind reeling, searching his face for some sign that this was a lie, a terrible ruse. But she found none. There was only the cold, monstrous Duke she had first heard of in whispers. The betrayal was absolute, a clean, brutal severing. Humiliation and a pain so profound it stole her breath washed over her. Mrs. Gable took her arm, and as she was led from the hall like a discarded object, she heard Alistair's final, dismissive words to the magistrate. Now, gentlemen, as this trivial matter is concluded, shall we discuss my estate? The journey back to the village was a blur of grief. Alara felt hollowed out, as if the vital parts of her had been scooped out and left behind in that cold stone hall. The familiar warmth of the bakery felt alien, the scent of bread cloying. For days, she moved in a stupor of heartbreak. But Alara was forged of resilient stuff. Her father had not raised a victim. As the initial agony subsided, it was replaced by a slow-burning anger. He had called her a diversion, of no consequence. But she knew better. The man who had shared stories by the fire, the man who had kissed her with such desperate tenderness, was not the same man who had dismissed her with such cruelty. She had seen the soul behind the scars, and that soul was not capable of such casual malice. It was an act, a terrible, costly performance to protect her. The realization did not lessen the pain, but it changed its nature. He had thought her weak, a damsel to be saved. He was wrong. Meanwhile, at Blackwood, Alistair had won. The inquiry was dropped, Valerius temporarily thwarted, but the victory tasted of ash. He had driven away the only light that had pierced his gloom in years. The silence of the library was no longer companionable. It was accusatory. Every polished book, every tended rosebush, was a testament to the woman he had wounded so grievously. He had chosen his title over his heart, his fortress over his freedom. He stalked the halls of his home not as a master, but as a prisoner, haunted by the memory of hazel eyes that had seen him, truly seen him, and had not looked away. He had saved her from his world, but in doing so, he had damned himself to an eternity of solitude. The cage was locked, and he alone held the key. A chance encounter in the village market provided the spark Alara needed. A young man, a former stable hand at Blackwood dismissed shortly after the fire, was speaking in hushed, drunken tones of the accident that had scarred the Duke. He spoke of Lord Valerius being present at the munitions depot that night, of a bitter argument over inheritance just before the explosion, of Valerius emerging from the chaos miraculously unscathed. It wasn't a hero's tale. It was a story of betrayal, of attempted murder. Alara realized with chilling certainty that Alistair's story of saving a man was a lie, a noble fiction he'd constructed to hide a far more terrible truth. His own cousin had tried to kill him. His scars were not a mark of honor, but a constant, physical reminder of that ultimate treachery. This was the true source of his prison. Armed with this dreadful knowledge, Alara knew she could not stand by. She returned to Blackwood, not as a servant, but as an equal. She used her knowledge of the grounds to bypass the main gate, entering through the overgrown gardens she had once tended. She found him in the library, a solitary figure nursing a brandy by the cold hearth. "You lied to me," she said, her voice clear and strong, echoing in the silent room. Alistair spun around, his face a mixture of shock and anguish. "Alara, You should not be here. Valeria set the fire, didn't he? She pressed, walking toward him, her gaze unwavering. You didn't save a man. You survived your own murder. And you've been hiding from that truth ever since. The accusation struck him like a physical blow. The lie he had carried for years crumbled under the weight of her steady gaze. He sank into a chair, the fight draining out of him. Yes, he finally whispered, the confession ragged. I couldn't bear the shame, the weakness of it. There is no shame in being a victim, she said fiercely. The shame is in letting the man who did this to you win. Her strength became his. Days later, Alistair Beaumont, Duke of Blackwood, walked into a formal hearing he himself had requested. He did not hide in the shadows. He stood in the full light of the chamber, his scars visible for all to see. He told them everything. The argument, the explosion, Valerius's treachery, and his own years of fearful silence. The assembly was stunned into silence. Then he turned his gaze to the gallery, where Ilara stood watching. To protect myself from further pain, I have lived a life of isolation, he announced, his voice ringing with newfound conviction. And in my fear, I recently committed a great cruelty. I dismissed a woman of unimpeachable character to protect her from my enemies. His eyes found hers, and he spoke directly to her, though the whole room listened. I was a fool. Her honesty is my shield, and her courage has become my own. I will not hide any longer, not from my past, and not from my heart. I love her. A scarred duke can only be healed by a woman who sees his heart, not his title, he thought, and for the first time he truly believed it. Valerius's treachery was exposed, his ambition turning to ruin. The scandal of a duke declaring his love for a commoner was the talk of the kingdom, but inside the walls of Blackwood, it was of no consequence. Alistair went to Ilara, not with the arrogance of a nobleman, but with the raw humility of a man begging for a second chance. He asked for her forgiveness, and with tears in her eyes, she gave it. Their reconciliation was not a fairy tale of a prince and a pauper, but the quiet, profound joining of two souls who had found their home in one another. A year later, sunlight streamed through the clean windows of the Blackwood Library. The gardens, once choked and forgotten, were a riot of color, the rosebush outside the window heavy with fragrant, crimson blooms. The sound of laughter, a sound once alien to these halls, echoed from the terrace. Ilara, now the Duchess of Blackwood, stood beside her husband, her hand resting on his arm. The scars on his face remained, pale lines against his skin, but they were no longer a map of ruin. They were simply a part of the man she loved, as much a part of him as the kindness in his eyes or the strength in his hands. He lifted her hand, the capable, gentle hand that had once been dusted with flour, and pressed his lips to her knuckles. They had faced down the ghosts of the past together, and in the ruins of an old, broken life, they had built a new one, founded not on titles or duty, but on the enduring, redemptive power of being truly seen.